actually. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited to welcome Rabbi Elaine Rose Glickman to teach us today about the Jewish views of the Messiah. Rabbi Glickman received her Master of Arts in Hebrew Letters and ordination from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she earned prizes for writing and academic excellence and graduated first in her class. Her book, Sacred Parenting, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and her other books include The Messiah and the Jews, Haman and the Jews, Bechol Levavcha, Living Torah, and her essays, sermons, and poetry are widely published, including in the National Jewish Book Award winner, The Women's Torah Commentary, which I use regularly. And she is happily married to Rabbi Brenner Glickman and is the proud mother of Mo, Leo, and Eden. And we love that. All right, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Liz, for inviting me to be here. And I'm really happy to be with all of you. Look forward to studying with you today. This is one of my favorite topics, is Jewish views on the Messiah. I've been interested in the Messiah since I was 15 years old. I didn't have the words at that time to say what the Messiah was or what my beliefs or what my curiosity was. But really, as I got into rabbinical school, then became a rabbi, I just learned more and more about it and have just long been fascinated. I find these teachings that I'm going to share with you today and next week to be extraordinarily inspirational and moving and fascinating, sometimes very challenging and sometimes very odd. But I think all of that is part of the beauty of it all. And I think when we say Messiah, we say, what do Jews believe about the Messiah? What do Jews think about the Messiah? Often we really either come up empty or come up with like so many like small ideas, things we've thought, things we've heard, things that, our Christian neighbors tell us that Jews must believe about the Messiah, things we know that our Christian neighbors believe that we don't believe. Hi, Cantus. But what we actually believe, what these mean to us, is sometimes a mystery. And I think that is something that we should rectify and something that we should reclaim, because I think that the belief in the Messiah and faith in the Messiah, I think is arguably Judaism's greatest gift to the world, and ironically, a gift, about which we don't know as much as we should. So hopefully, we'll change some of that today with our study. So I'm going to start with a statement. This is according to Moses Maimonides, the great 12th century philosopher, doctor, scholar, everything. Arguably, the greatest, smartest, Jew who ever lived. He formulated 13 principles of Judaism, the 13 essential principles of Judaism. And some of them probably we don't have a lot of difficulty in accepting. Like one of them, for example, is that God is incorporeal, that we can't, see or touch God, right? Like that's all right. I feel like we're all on board with that. That sounds great. The 13th is a belief in the resurrection of the dead, which we'll talk about next week. We might be a little bit less certain about that one, but the one I want to focus on and begin with is principle number 12. And in Hebrew, we say, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'viat HaMashiach ve'af al pi she'yitmachecha im kol zeh ani ma'amin, which is, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, and though he may tarry, even with all this, I believe. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. It sounds really simple, right? And simple in terms of it says clearly, this is what I believe. This is the extent of my belief, but also simple as we might say in a pejorative, kind of way, like it's simplistic. I believe in the coming of the Messiah. Just to say that it's very, and even though he may tarry, to take all of the things that have happened to us as individuals and as a people over the last thousands of years, and just to say, though he may tarry, just to dismiss all of that difficulty, all of that challenge, all of that suffering, all of that persecution, all of that horror and devastation as an example of, though the Messiah may tarry, even with all this, I believe. It's simple to say, and it might sound simplistic to believe. But I think that I would say simple rather than simplistic, rather than simple-minded. I would argue that I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, though he may tarry, even with all this, I believe. I would say that simple in this case means fundamental. And I think that this simple fundamental statement is what has saved Judaism. And you might wonder how. So for this part, I ask you to please close your eyes. Close your eyes and imagine that everything has been taken away from you. Everything has been taken away from you. The temple where you worship, the city where you live, the community that you know, the religion that you practice, the way that you communicate with God, your sign, your assurance that God is with you. All of that has been taken away. Not only taken away, but destroyed, burned to ashes. And as it burns, you're told that it's a sign that God isn't with you anymore. You've been sent into exile. You know that your children, your children's children, your children's children's children will be born and will live and will die in a land that is not yours, surrounded by people who are not yours. Learning, being taught, being persecuted. Their children, and their children. Okay, open your eyes. Because this is what happened to nations, so many nations thousands of years ago. It happened to so many nations in the ancient Near East. It happened to nations who do not exist anymore, whose names are consigned to history, who live only in stone tablets and textbooks that are used in graduate schools. And it actually happened to us. It happened to our ancestors. If our ancestors had been like the other nations of their time, they also would have given up. They would have died out. They wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here. But I would argue that our ancestors were different. They did not let their ways burn with their city, and they did not let their faith burn with their temple. What did they do instead? They did something that was radical, that was fundamental, that was simple. They started believing in the Messiah. So that leads to the question, what does it mean to believe in the Messiah? What does it mean to believe in the Messiah? As we'll find out in our time together, it means many different things. We talk about the Messiah. We also talk about the Messianic age. We talk about Messianic redemption, Messianic time, and we'll talk about them individually, kind of how they differ as we continue our time together. But for now, to group them all together, Messiah, Messianic redemption, Messianic age, they've meant many different things at different times. For some, and in some periods, for some people, they've meant a human being who will bring about the restoration of ancient Israel and the Davidic monarchy, the kingship over Jerusalem, over Israel, rooted in the house of David. For some, it has meant a superhuman figure, not a human being at all, but a supernatural figure who will lead Israel to triumph in apocalyptic and bloody battles. For some, it has meant a figure who will inaugurate a completely altered universe that will include, as we talked about, as Maimonides stated, a physical resurrection of the dead. For some, it doesn't mean a person or a figure at all, but rather humanity, the whole of humanity, working together to perfect ourselves as individuals, ourselves as a community, and ourselves, you might say, as the universe. For some, it means a freedom of war, freedom from persecution, freedom from subjugation. And for some, it has meant communion with the divine, an actual physical communion linking with the divine in a way that we have not heretofore experienced and that cannot be experienced until the age of the Messiah. So all of these are ways that Messiah has been considered. And again, we'll get into them more deeply in our time together. But even the most irrational and the most apparently rational, whether you believe in a superhuman figure and these apocalyptic battles, whether you believe in communion with the divine, whether you believe in a human being, all of them share common beliefs. A common conviction exists in all of them. And I believe that this is the simple, as in fundamental, belief of our ancestors that has rescued us and that has carried us forward, that has preserved us and sustained us. And those common beliefs are belief that human history has meaning, that there is meaning in human history, that human history has a purpose, that there is a purpose, a significance in what happens to us, that even though the year we celebrate our cycle, of the Jewish holidays of the year, even though that is cyclical, even though life is cyclical in some way, that ultimately life is also linear. History is linear, that we are moving towards an ultimate goal. And I think the most important, most fundamental, most simple, we are not alone. We as humanity are not alone in the universe. There is a plan for us. This world, this life, as we experience it, this is not all that there is. And finally, things will get better than this. Things will get better than this. So those beliefs, I would argue, are Judaism's greatest gift to the world. And if you believe in even one of these statements, even if you haven't thought of yourself as a believer before, even if you believe in even one of these statements, you believe in redemption. And once you believe in redemption, it's a very short path, I think, to believing in the Messiah. So you may very well believe in the Messiah. And it is this belief that saved Judaism. Judaism was, and I use Judaism, Israelite religion, I'm just going to use them, interchangeably. I know you can argue, Judaism didn't start until, centuries later. At this point that I'm talking about in, the Bible and the Torah is like ancient Israelite religion, but I'm just using them all interchangeably. I think it's this belief that saved Judaism. Judaism, before, thousands of years before the Common Era, we were a land-centered religion. We were centered in the land. We were centered in the promised land. That was absolutely fundamental to what it meant. To be Jewish, to be in covenant with God. What was a sign of God's favor? That we were in the land. God has promised us that throughout the Torah and Deuteronomy. We see all the time. I will favor you if you are in my favor. If you please me, I will give you the land. You will dwell secure in the land. You will stay safe in the land. It is a sign of God's being with us, God's favor. We are rooted in the land. How do we worship God? How do we commune with God? How do we show thanksgiving to God? How do we praise God? How do we observe our holidays? How do we ask for forgiveness? How do we relate to God? How do we gain God's attention and God's favor? By worshiping in the temple. The temple in Jerusalem, it must be in Jerusalem. How do we worship? To some degree, right, the Levites, probably sang some psalms, but the primary way that we worship, that we commune with God is through animal sacrifices. So how do we communicate with God? Through animal sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem, which is the demonstration that we are in covenant with God, that God is there for us, that God is in relationship with us. And by whom are we ruled? We are ruled by kings. And who appoints these kings? Well, these kings come from the house of David, and King David, chosen by God, is the one who rules, by God's will, by God's desire, by God's design. So we are a land-centered religion. We primarily worship through animal sacrifice, which can only be offered in the land. And we are ruled over the people who are kind of God's chosen, God's elect, rule over us as God's representatives, you might say, ruling by God's favor in the land. So what happens? The system works and works and works until it doesn't. In the year 721 before the Common Era, the northern kingdom of Israel, those were what come to be known as the 10 lost tribes, falls to Assyria. The Assyrian Empire conquers the northern kingdom, exiles the 10 tribes, moves other people from the Assyrian kingdom into the land, removes the Jews who have been living in that land, scatters them among the other peoples of Assyria, the other conquered peoples of Assyria. They become known as the 10 lost tribes. And then in 586 before the Common Era, the southern kingdom, and this includes Jerusalem, this includes the temple, this includes the kings who rule as the representatives, the descendants of the house of David, falls to Babylonia. So now we have no land, no temple, no way of communing with God. And the fact that this has happened is seen as the idea that God is no longer with us. God has either allowed this to happen because God has turned God's back on us, or because, God forbid, the gods of the Babylonians are stronger than our God. Either way, at this point, it should be game over for the Jews. It should be the end of our people. And there is certainly plenty of that. There's certainly plenty of misery and plenty of mourning. And with that, I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Okay. Can you see? I assume y'all can see it. Thumbs up. Okay, good. So this is just a print that I really, really love. This is from a 16th century Haggadah, and it's a depiction, it looks maybe a woodcut of the Messiah entering into the Golden Gate of Jerusalem. So these are some of our responses. This is one of our responses to the loss of the temple in Jerusalem, to the loss of our time as we know it. One example, famously so, was mourning, the mourning and the grief that we see in Psalm 137. Does somebody want to read it for us? Just so you don't have to hear my voice the entire time. If somebody, I don't know all of y'all to call on you, but if somebody just wants to unmute and read it, if that's okay, that would be great.
By the waters of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy.
Thank you, Rabbi Liz. So this is one of the things we did not deny, and I think this is something that's so amazing about Judaism that we don't always give ourselves enough credit for, or get enough credit for, is we don't deny that evil is real and that suffering is real. We don't go with, and again, this is a huge generalization, but, in general, the idea of the Eastern religions is that there is not the, that we don't have, sorry, one sec, my phone that I thought had turned off, it did not, okay. So there is a sense that, evil is an illusion, if you will, that it can be overcome, spiritually, it can be denied. It doesn't, if we can get ourselves to a higher plane, we don't feel it. And the idea, I think that we see, again, generalization that we can see, not always, but we can see sometimes in some branches of Christianity, is that suffering is good, that suffering is, especially for Jewish people, that it's, that it's a sign, like even if someone is suffering something, means that something really good is happening. Of course, that's rooted, I think in the idea of the crucifixion, right? But what I love about Judaism is that we don't deny the reality of suffering, that we straight on, like we sit and we weep. May my right hand, like if I don't mourn enough, if I don't remember that this devastation is real and that it is painful, if I am not appropriately attuned to the devastation of myself, of my people, of my faith. May my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. Like, I mean, what does that even mean? Like, may I not be able to use my hand? May I not be able to speak if I don't remember you, Jerusalem? We don't deny the grief. We engage with the grief. We acknowledge the grief is real. And yet, we didn't only grieve. We didn't only mourn as we faced the loss of everything we had known. We also heeded oracles like this one from the prophet Ezekiel from the same time. And unless somebody wants to relieve Rabbi Liz, I'm going to ask her to read it for us again. But if somebody else feels brave and wants to read, please unmute and do so.
I will take you from among the nations and gather you from all the countries, and I will bring you back to your own land. I will people your settlements, and the ruined places shall be rebuilt. And the desolate land, after lying waste in the sight of every passerby, shall again be tilled. And the people shall say, that land, once desolate, has become like the Garden of Eden.
Thank you. Beautiful. So we have both, right? We have the acknowledgement of the devastation and the grief, and yet we also have this promise. Imagine, from our perspective, it's easy. I mean, easier, right? Because we know, I mean, history's still unfolding. We don't know how it ends, but we know at this point, like what our, current known ending is. We know, oh, right, that's going to happen. We're going to have Israel again. We're going to have Jerusalem. All of that is going to happen. But can you imagine, like, they had no idea. They had no idea to be by the waters of Babylon weeping, and yet to be able to say, to believe, I will bring you back to your own land. That had never happened before in the history of humanity. And yet to have this faith to say that land, once desolate, has become like the Garden of Eden. So we kept faith with God, and we kept believing that things would get better than this. But of course, it wasn't just the conquering of the Assyrian Empire. It wasn't just the Babylonian exile. It was in the year 70 of the Common Era when the Second Temple fell to Rome. It was in 1096 when Crusaders on the march to the Holy Land marched through Central Europe and decimated her Jews along the way. It was during the time of the Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain, the Golden Age of Spain for the Jewish people, the expulsion in 1492. It was during the massacres of Eastern European Jews in the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th centuries. And we kept believing that things would get better than this, even when Europe burned her Jews during the Holocaust. We kept speaking with the Psalms about the weeping and the devastation. May my right hand lose its cutting. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I forget this evil, if I forget this pain, if I forget this suffering, and yet this belief that God would return to us, that this land, this people once desolate, has become like the Garden of Eden. So we are still waiting. We are waiting for redemption. We are waiting for the Messiah. So what does it mean to wait for the Messiah? Well, for that, I'll put my screen back on. Glad you asked. Okay. The first thing we hear about, we talk about the Messiah, it can mean so many things, but the earliest version of when we talk about the Messiah, we talk about the Messiah with what I would call a lowercase m. A lowercase m. So what does Messiah literally mean? What does the Messiah literally mean? The word Mashiach, Messiah, is first used as a noun in the Bible, but not used in the same way that we often think of it now. It was a person, an actual regular human being, according to the Bible, who was singled out by God for some specific purpose to advance the cause of Israel. But other than that, a regular human being, nothing supernatural, nothing, no like amazing birth story, no, quest, hero's journey, anything like that would, assume supernatural or godlike roots, but a human being. And in fact, 3 human beings in the Bible are named as the Messiah. One is Saul, King Saul, the first king over Israel. One is David, King David, say the greatest king over Israel. And one is actually not even a Jew, but is Cyrus, King Cyrus, who was the Persian king, who, according really to history, who conquered the Babylonians who had exiled the Jews, and then the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, and the Persians, under King Cyrus, issued what came to be known as the Decree of Cyrus. You can actually see it. It was, it's on a cylinder, like it's inscribed in a stone cylinder that, like 10 years ago, was on display in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I dragged my family, to see it. But it's an actual archaeological, I mean, you can actually see the Decree of Cyrus inscribed on a stone cylinder. And it was a decree that those conquered by the Babylonians, including the Jews, could return to their lands and could, rebuild their communities, could rebuild their houses of worship. So King Saul, King David, King Cyrus, each of them called a Messiah in the Bible, not as the supernatural redeemer for all time, but as an individual, a human being, a regular man, and sorry, it's always men, who were singled out by God for some specific purpose to advance the cause of Israel. The word Messiah, Mashiach, is also it's a Hebrew word. It has, almost every Hebrew word has what's called a shoresh, a root, that is 3 Hebrew letters long. In this, the Hebrew letters are mem, shin, chet, just the Hebrew letters mem, shin, chet, and it is a verb that means to anoint, but it doesn't mean necessarily, again, anointed in the same way that it is now. It's more anoint with the lowercase a. What does it mean? It means to pour oil over the head of a ruler, over a ruler's head. So the practice actually originated in Egypt. It was practiced by the Canaanites long before we Israelites, we Jews, entered the promised land. And it was not originally, only for kings. If you were a priest, you were anointed as the priest. Oil, sacred oil, was poured over your head. If you were a leper, God forbid, if you had leprosy, you would be anointed, the oil poured over your head to signify that you were, clean, that you were healthy, that you were permitted back into the camp. Although over time, the anointing did become an essential feature of the coronation of a king, the anointing with oil of a king during the coronation. And we can assume that there was sort of seen as like a sacred, almost divine aspect to this ceremony over time, because at the time of King Solomon, it's interesting, the oil that was used in the coronation of King Solomon was kept in the Aron HaKodesh, like in a holy ark, and an ark of, cabinet of carrying that was dedicated to the use of sacred and holy objects. But even still, it's not until later that the term Messiah gets a capital M, if you will, and becomes not just a figure, like a historical figure like King Saul, King David, and King Cyrus, who, does something wonderful, yes, and is singled out by God for some purpose, yes, but is, born a human, dies a human, a lowercase m. But later, we come to see the Messiah with a capital M. And that would be the Davidic Messiah. So the earliest incarnation of this Messiah, of the capital M Davidic Messiah, is embodied, I would argue, most significantly in the books of the prophets, in the book of the Psalms, in the books of Psalms. The figure is not called the Messiah. Interestingly, we don't see the word Messiah used in these contexts, but the qualities of this figure really embodies the earliest characteristics and the earliest purposes of the Messiah. So this is one of my favorite examples. This is of the talking about the Davidic Messiah, again, though without using the word Messiah, but still describing the figure, describing the qualities, and describing the impact and the destiny of the capital M Davidic Messiah. This is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 11. So somebody, Rabbi Liz, if no one else volunteers, but if somebody else would like to unmute and read, that would be amazing.
A shoot shall grow out of the stump of King David's father Jesse. A twig shall sprout from his stalk. The Spirit of the Eternal shall alight upon him. A spirit of wisdom and insight, a spirit of counsel and valor, a spirit of devotion and reverence for the Eternal. In that day, the stock of Jesse that has remained standing shall become a standard to peoples. Nations shall seek his counsel, and his abode shall be honored.
Thank you. Good. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Liz. So I want to ask, what qualities are exemplified by this Davidic Messiah. And again, if you just want to either put it in the chat or unmute and speak out loud, or if you don't want to share, that's fine. I'll just tell you what I think the qualities are. But if you want to share, what do we see? What qualities are going to be exemplified by the Davidic Messiah according to this passage? Anybody say it, put it in the chat.
Wisdom,
Wisdom, excellent.
devotion.
Wisdom and devotion, excellent. Thank you. Anything else?
He seems pretty perfect.
Pretty perfect. I love it. Thank you.
Smart.
Smart, excellent. Good. What else?
Renowned.
Renowned, excellent.
Richard put in the chat, leader.
Leader, perfect. Good. Excellent. Thank you. Now, exactly. These are wonderful. So the Davidic Messiah, again, not a supernatural person, not a supernatural figure, definitely a human being. But as we said, right, as a human being who is pretty close to perfect, who, I mean, I'm sure we're all wonderful, but is maybe, kind of like us, but more so, who has extreme wisdom and devotion, who has extreme brilliance, somebody who is renowned, who is, glorified, respected by the other nations, right? Nations shall seek his counsel, his abode shall be honored, and who is an unquestioned leader. This becomes the prototype, if you will, of the Davidic Messiah, as is going to be understood kind of in the first phase of Messianic belief. It's going to be a human being, but a human being who can, through intense wisdom, intense devotion, intense brilliance, renown, leadership, said, pretty perfect. Not a superhuman figure, but such a strong figure that they can overcome the challenges and the difficulties of this time and lead Israel as God's anointed one, as the Davidic Messiah. We also see, in addition to these, sort of personal qualities, that they have to be a descendant of King David, right? A shoot shall grow out of the stump of King David's father, Jesse. It has to be a descendant of King David. And they will have a special relationship with God. They will restore the Davidic monarchy and will be honored by the other nations. And then, interestingly, his abode shall be honored. What does that refer to, you think? His abode. What is the reference to?
The temple, or at least generally Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's what I would argue too, that the abode is a reference to Jerusalem, to the temple, that the Messiah has to go along with a restoration to the land of Israel, that it cannot be independent to the land. It cannot be independent of the land of Israel. But this is what's interesting, that as we talked about, with the decree of Cyrus, then we will return to the land. The Jewish people will indeed return to the land in the 6th century before the Common Era. We will have permission to rebuild the temple. We will reinstitute animal sacrifices. We will be restored to his abode, to Israel, to Jerusalem, to the temple. And yet, belief in the Messiah and kind of longing for this Davidic Messiah did not end after our return to the land. And I think it's really interesting to imagine why that would be. Why would this image of a Davidic Messiah, this longing for a Davidic Messiah, why would it endure even after we've returned to the land? I definitely have thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear y'all's. Again, if you want to put in the chat or just want to unmute and share.
We were still under, some level of occupation, still in some, depended on who was ruling, but at least paying taxes, if not like active, military overrule, not an independent kingdom.
Good. We were not really fully independent, except, for that little bit of time, under the Maccabees, under the Hasmoneans. And even then, the conditions were not, necessarily what we were aspiring to, what we would hope. Thank you, Rabbi Liz. Anybody else? But I would say, really what Rabbi Liz has to say is exactly right. Even though we did return to the land, it turned out maybe that wasn't quite enough. That we still, even returning to land was not messianic. And the actions of the rulers, in some cases, actually increased our longing for a Davidic Messiah, because what was happening under some of the Hasmonean rulers, some of the those who were even the Jewish kings who were ruling over Israel, it wasn't great. It wasn't right. So it kind of made us even wish for a better ruler. Even though we had sovereignty in the land, it wasn't the sovereignty we felt we deserved. It wasn't the sovereignty we wanted. So we looked even harder for a descendant of King David, for this wise, devoted, smart, renowned leader that's promised in the book of Isaiah. Also, what was very interesting is that by longing for a Messiah and saying that the proper ruler, the one who really had the right to rule over the land of Israel, had to be a descendant of King David, it was actually so smart in a way, because it preserved a status quo. It meant that no one person could rise up and say, I am the Davidic Messiah, I am the descendant of David who is destined to rule over you, because the genealogies at that point, after all of our time in exile, were such a mess that no one could prove that they were actually a descendant of King David. So it preserved the status quo. If no one can be the Davidic Messiah, then it means that we're sort of safe, from like a messianic pretender arising. And what's especially interesting is when we look at in the Christian Bible, in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1 and Gospel of Luke chapter 3, we see that the genealogy of Jesus is written out to try to prove that he was in fact a descendant of King David. Like by that point, you really can't prove it. But the fact that the authors of the Gospels try so hard to prove that, it just shows that, even in the time of Jesus, even centuries later, the idea that yes, the Messiah had to be a descendant of King David, that was something that was just, it was unquestioned. So I'm going to pause for just a second. Do people have questions or anything like that? I'm going to stop my screen share so I can see y'all better. If you just want to raise your hand or unmute yourself or anything like that. And if I can't answer your question, I will look it up and try to answer it better next week. Anything? All right. Let's see. Okay. Then let me do my shared screen again. Okay. I'm worried that I'm not gonna have time for this. So, but you know what? It's good. Okay, so we'll try doing this. Okay. So the significance of the land and the ingathering of the exiles. As we said, this is really practical, right? On one sense, it's a very practical thing. If you're going to have a Messiah, if you're going to have a monarchy, if you're going to have a ruler from the house of David who's been, granted kind of hexure, granted the right to rule by God, I mean, they have to have some place to rule, right? You have to have a sovereign land. It doesn't really help to have a sovereign who doesn't have any land, over which to rule. So returning to the land is a necessary condition. But it's not sufficient, if you will. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. As our ancestors found after the decree of Cyrus and the rebuilding of the Second Temple, and we've actually realized it anew with the founding of what we can call the Third Commonwealth or the modern state of Israel, that even though we have sovereignty over the land, it's not necessarily the same thing as having the Messiah, right? There's still plenty of shortcomings. There's still plenty of work that needs to be done. So this is kind of a promise. This is why it shows that the land is a necessary condition, if you will, because again, restoration to the land is a sign, not just a sign, but like is a concrete manifestation of the idea that we are in relationship with God, that we have God's favor. And that is, of course, a necessary condition of the Messianic time. So if somebody would like to read this, this is from, where is this from? This is from Deuteronomy chapter 30. So if somebody wants to unmute and read it, that would be great.
When
you and your children heed God's command with all your heart and soul, then the eternal your God will restore your fortunes and take you back in love. Even if you're dispersed or at the ends of the world, from there the eternal your God will gather you. From there God will fetch you, and the eternal your God shall bring you to the land in which your forebears dwelt, and you shall dwell in it.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you. So we'll see, this is a sign of reconciliation with God. And not only that, but what does it mean? Not only in terms of our relationship with God, but I don't know what's going on here. Okay. Not only in terms of our relationship with God, but what it means for us as a people. Can I ask you just to continue reading? This is from Rabbi Judah ben Betzalel, who, according to tradition, was the creator of the Golem of Prague, incidentally. But anyway, would you just continue reading it for us? Exiles in an unnatural condition.
Exile is an unnatural condition. The natural state is for each people to dwell on its own soil. The present condition of Israel is a break in the order of the universe, which must be mended.
Beautiful. Thank you. So it's not only that we are going to be in the land as a sign of God's favor, but it's also the sign of the natural order, if you will. The natural order is for us to be in our own land. Our present condition is a break in the order of the universe. So again, it's a movement from exile to restoration to the land. It's a movement from maybe not being in God's favor to being in God's favor. Most of all, it's a movement from the way things are to the way things ought to be. And that is really what Messianism is all about, that things are going to get better than this. Exile is an unnatural condition. Therefore, we will no longer be exiled. When we heed God's command, then God will take us back in love. When God takes us back in love, we will be in the land. Again, the movement from where things are to the way things should be. And that is the belief in redemption, the belief in the Messiah. It's also practical in that, the essential elements of the Messiah can only be accomplished in Israel. You have to have restoration of the Davidic monarchy. You have to have the temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. You have to have the reinstitution of the animal sacrifices. Again, I'm not saying this data, I'm saying the earliest formulations of the Messianic belief. You have to have the ingathering of the exiles. All of those who have been exiled from the land will be able to and will return to Israel. And you have to have Jewish sovereignty in the land. You have to have Jewish sovereignty in the land. All of those for this earliest version, and again, not for all of them, but for this earliest version of Messianic belief, these are the necessary conditions. This is what we have to have. So to summarize what we've learned so far, this is a little interesting segue, but I don't think we'll have time for that right now. Okay, so basically the Davidic Messiah is what we would call a realistic Messiah. A realistic Messiah, by definition, this Messiah, this earliest version, earliest formulation Messianic belief, the Messiah will by definition be a human being. The human being of the Messiah will achieve goals that are difficult and are admirable and are challenging, but will do so, as we said, when we looked at Isaiah 11, will do so because this Davidic Messiah will be filled with wisdom, devotion, intelligence, renown, and will be an exemplary leader, will be pretty perfect. But the goals are possible because of the Messiah's outstanding personal qualities and outstanding abilities, not because of any supernatural intervention or supernatural powers. What's also really interesting is that the goals of this Messiah are particular rather than universal. As we'll see in later Messianic belief, the the impact of the Messiah will be on the entire world, on the entire universe, if you will. But at this point, this earliest formulation, the goals are very particular: a restoration to the land, the reinstitution of the Davidic monarchy, the reinstitution of the traditional animal sacrifices. We're not talking about turning the world on its head. We're not talking about changing the order of the universe. We're not even talking about really, except in the, most, just sort of collateral, damage. We're not really even talking about any other effect on any other nations. It is all very particular. And this, I think, is summed up just to, for our last quote to be from Moses Maimonides. If somebody would like to read, this is his summation of what the world of the Messiah will be like. And it's interesting just to focus on even, like, I don't know, like about 1500 years after the formulation in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, about what the Davidic Messiah will be like, from that earliest formulation 1500 years later, just to see how that particular image of the Messiah is still, is still alive and well in the time of Moses Maimonides. If somebody would like to read it for us, the sages said.
The sages said that the only difference between this world and the days of the Messiah will be with regard to the enslavement to the kingdoms. The sages and the prophets yearned for the days of the Messiah, not in order that they should rule over the whole world, and not in order that they should lord it over the idolaters, and not in order that the nations should elevate them, and not in order that they should eat and drink and rejoice, but in order that they should devote themselves to the Torah and its wisdom, and that there be nobody to oppress them and to negate.
Beautiful. Thank you. Isn't that so lovely?
It is lovely.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? And it's just it's so simple, right? In some ways, and yet so encompassing and also so beautiful. So I have, let's see. Okay, so that's what I've for sure have. I have another, few quotes and other aspects of, what I can talk about before my last concluding text and concluding thought. But I just wanted to open it up for questions. If anybody has questions or ideas or anything that you want to share, please do. Yes.
So if it has to ensure the Davidic, if the Messiah has to be an ancestor of David, and they've all gone everywhere, how do they prove that?
That's an excellent question, right? Well, that may be in part why, as we'll see, why the aspects of the Messiah and like the belief in what the Messiah is going to be changes. How do we know? I guess now, with 23andMe, right, we might be able to tell more easily. But it would honestly, there'd be really no way to know absolutely for sure. Saadia Gaon, like the great 10th century figure, philosopher, and scholar, talked about that one of the ways that we can believe in what we've been told is reliable testimony, that we don't have any, it's not to have a video, the revelation at Sinai or the, parting the Red Sea or anything, but because people we trust have told us that it happens, that we believe that. So I would say it would be kind of the same, the same sort of thing. It would have to be somebody that, who'd come forward, who'd be acclaimed as a descendant of King David, or would call themselves a descendant of King David. We would really, sort of have to believe them. And that does become a catch-22, right? Like a virtual cycle. Like if somebody, says, oh, I'm a descendant of King David, but they don't show any of these Davidic qualities, we're not going to believe them, even if they are physically a descendant of King David. And if they show what we might think of as these Davidic qualities and say, oh, I'm a descendant of King David, we, probably, would believe them even if not. So it's really, that's a great question. And it really would just be a matter of faith.
That brings me to a question that I kind of still have, and maybe, next week as we talk more about the progression of Messianic thought, you'll get to this, but, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on the difference between Christian and Jewish. I don't want to get super into why Jesus is a false Messiah, but I am curious. So the Gospels go through this effort to talk about how he's descended from David, but he still doesn't really fulfill any of the other things. I mean, I guess like wisdom, people seek his counsel, some of that, but he doesn't restore the monarchy. He does, and then like as some of the later stuff comes around about universal redemption and things like that didn't happen. The lion shall lie down with the lamb, that doesn't happen. And I read in I think it was Riza Aslan's book on Jesus of Nazareth, the historical character, that there were actually several Jewish messiahs from Galilee around that time period. We know Bar Kokhba was believed to maybe be a messiah as well. So, like, I guess I'm curious, how did Jews themselves, not even like how Christianity developed this idea around Jesus, but how did Jews reconcile that these ideas about what the Messiah should be bringing with like these people that were clearly not doing that? I mean, I guess I know with Bar Kokhba, at least Rabbi Akiva believed that he would, that the revolt would lead to the establishment of the kingdom again, and then it just didn't. But like some of these others that were just like renegades, I don't understand. Yeah, I don't know. Do you know?
No, I know what you mean. And we've had a history, Jesus definitely, is most successful, you would say, but there have definitely been histories of, messiahs in Jewish community who turned out, not to be. And so one of the things that can happen, and one of the times that becomes the most dangerous, I would say, in some ways, and also the most fertile for like what you would call, messianic pretenders or false messiahs to arise, is after a period of great trauma in the Jewish community or in history, when people are really willing to suspend their belief. I mean, you can just see, even what happens in our own time, people who have, you think you have these certain, you think you have these beliefs that are ironclad, and then, something happens and suddenly you're willing to, think differently, challenge everything sort of, falls apart. It's much easier to say, this is what I believe and I will never change my mind when things aren't happening, to help you change your mind. And then some of the beliefs about the Messiah also, like what differentiates, the current Jewish understanding of the Messiah from the Christian belief, some of that, I mean, remember Jesus, that was like, over 2,000 years ago, right? So some of the things that, we've come to believe about the Messiah have been, sort of in contrast, or to stand against, what the Jewish Christians and then, later the Gentile Christians came to believe. But I think that, part of what happened, I mean, when Jesus arose, he was extremely charismatic. And it was a time of, extreme flux, extreme difficulty. It was, kind of the Romans were encroaching, on Judea, on Jerusalem, on the sovereignty, the heretofore sovereignty of the Jewish people. The Jewish community itself was, was splitting apart with the Zealots and the Sicarii. I mean, there was tremendous like Jew on Jew violence, if you will. And I think it was really the time for a quote unquote, messianic pretender to arise. People were ready to believe, wanted to believe in something. Same thing like with Bar Kokhba, who arose in, about 130 or so of the Common Era during the time of the Hadrianic persecutions, which was an especially intense time of Roman persecution against the Jews. If you look also, probably the most devastating messianic pretender, false messiah in like relatively modern times was Shabbatai Tzvi, who, I mean, really was, I mean, so long ago now we don't think about it. At the time, it was a tremendous challenge to the Jewish community, Sephardic and Levant communities especially. And he arose out of the tumult and the turmoil surrounding the expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition that was just so devastating to Jewish people. And I read, I forgot who it was. I'll have to look it up, but there was a really compelling, very convincing essay that said the only reason that there wasn't a messianic pretender who arose after the Holocaust, the only reason that there wasn't a messianic pretender after the Holocaust who arose and could really have split the Jewish community, was because of the establishment of the state of Israel. That need for the Messiah, that longing for the Messiah, that readiness to believe in something that was just a drastic break from everything that had come before. That energy, that longing was poured into the upbuilding of the state of Israel. And it's because of the state of Israel that we were spared, a messianic pretender rising and taking all of that energy, all of that longing, and, just devastating what was left of the Jewish community.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions, comments, anything at all?
This is simplistic. I hate to say it, but there's so much information given that has to be a very simplistic question. On the one hand, a return to the land is messianic. Okay, and then on the other hand, on one hand is that the return to the land is messianic, and then on the other hand is that it's a person. I'm having trouble reconciling those two thoughts.
That there's a return to the land, that the idea of it being necessary but not sufficient. Is that what you mean?
I didn't think that, but now I do.
Oh, okay. Well, I do have here, I'll show you. It's funny you said that, because I always prepare like way too much, but this is a whole thing, the challenge of the state of Israel to traditional messianism, an interesting tangent, because the idea of how we understand the fact that there is, a third commonwealth, that there is a state of Israel, and yet it's not the Messiah. It is a tremendous challenge in many ways, so that we don't have time for it, but I do have the texts on that. So, if you want, we can talk about it a little bit, next week, or I can even just send you the quotes if you want to grapple with them, on your own. And so we have that. Good. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Well, in that case, let me share the screen again. And this is the last quote that I wanted to share with you, and we will talk about this a lot later on. It's interesting. It's not going to be really, it's in Reform Judaism, starting at around the 19th century, that we really see in earnest the idea that human beings can have kind of a day-to-day role in bringing the Messiah and Messianic age. The idea that we are truly God's partners, that we have a strong not only obligation, but also the ability to bring about the Messiah by our actions. We really don't see that develop strongly until, as I said, about the 19th century. But we do see, even throughout this earlier literature, we see hints that we can bring the Messiah. We can have some role in bringing the Messiah, even if only by our own piety, inducing God to bring the Messiah. And we see there is a section, passage in the Zohar that, if we were to observe Shabbat correctly for 2 weeks in a row, that would be enough for God to bring the Messiah. But we see occasionally before Reform Judaism in the 19th century, but especially once Reform takes off, the idea that our individual acts, especially acts of goodness and acts of compassion, acts of ethics, not necessarily ritual, ceremonial, we might think of as religious, but the idea of like social action, social justice, the deeds of loving kindness, that these can impact the bringing of the Messiah. Again, we'll see that much more so starting in the 19th century with Reform Judaism, but we do see it hinted at in earlier passages. And this is just, it's a famous one, and it is one of my favorites. And hopefully it will be a reminder to us to pursue the Messiah by pursuing deeds of loving kindness in the week ahead. And Rabbi Liz, if I could prevail on you to read this last passage and to bring us to our conclusion, please, I would be grateful.
Rabbi Joshua ben Levi encounters Elijah the prophet and asks him, "When will the Messiah come?" "Go and ask him yourself," Elijah replies. "He is sitting at the entrance to the city of Rome among the poor and the diseased." They unwind all of their bandages at once, then rewind them, but he unwinds and rewinds the bandages one at a time, so that if he is summoned, there shall be no delay in his arrival. After finding and greeting the man destined to be the Messiah, Rabbi Joshua asks when he will reveal himself as Israel's Redeemer. "Today," the Messiah replies. But the day passes, and Rabbi Joshua complains to Elijah, "The Messiah lied to me, for he said, 'Today I shall come,' and he did not come." But Elijah has an explanation. "This is what he told you," Elijah corrects Rabbi Joshua. Today, if you hearken to God's voice.
If you hearken to God's voice. So may we all in the week ahead hearken to God's voice. May we all serve those who are poor, who are diseased, who are in need. May we bring hope to those who do not have hope. And may we all do our part in bringing the Messiah. And I hope you'll join us next week. Thank you so much, Rabbi Liz, for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for being here. Shavua Tov, wishing you a good week and everything just wonderful and beautiful in the days ahead.
Amen. Thank you for that closing blessing and this wonderful teaching. We'll see you next week.
I will look forward to it. Thank y'all so much.
Right. Bye.